Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode 37 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. This is where we cover hard talk about the hardest form of money. If we're meeting for the first time, my name is Simon Dixon, and I've been obsessing over the topic of Bitcoin investing and money for the last 2 decades now. Obviously, Bitcoin came out a lot later, but I started as a monetary and banking reformer before joining the Bitcoin community very early on. So today we are going to be discussing everything about the Bitcoin crash. So we are below, and I'm not sure what the price is right now. Maybe we rebounded back up again. But last time I looked, we were around about the $55,000 mark, and we crashed below $55,000. And if this is your first time having lived through one of our Bitcoin corrections or Bitcoin crashes, whatever you want to call it, then I'm going to share with you, welcome to the party. My challenge to everybody has always been that you need to own more Bitcoin every month than you did the previous month, and you need to hold that discipline for 4 years. Once you do it for 4 years, you will become what I have always called a Bitcoin thinker rather than a fiat thinker. A fiat thinker values their wealth in dollars, in pounds, in euros, and they get wrecked. They save in dollars, pounds, and euros, and they use the worst form of technology for saving that the world has ever invented, called fiat currency, which is backed by a proof of weapons network. And that proof of weapons network has a bunch of miners called banks and node operators that determine what the supply should be, called lobby groups, from the largest industrial complexes like the military, big pharma, and the banking complexes, which direct the flow of your money and leave you deep wrecked in an inflation, in a cost of living crisis, with the pretense that politicians can solve it. So every few years, we keep saying, let's go more to the left or more to the right. On the right, they will spend less, but they spend more. On the left, they will fix our cost of living crisis by giving us more, but they give us more and give us more inflation. And that is designed into the system. And if you want to resist against that, then you need to start thinking in Bitcoin. And Bitcoin thinking means you value your wealth in Bitcoin. And when you value your wealth in Bitcoin, you earn your fiat currency, and the lower the price, the more Bitcoin you get to accumulate each and every month. And you save in hard money, because hard money is a resistance movement. It's proof of work rather than proof of weapons. Proof of work is backed by a decentralized network, which is powered and secured by electricity. Electronity. I like electronity. Let's call it electronity. Electricity. And with a proof of work network is your way out of the trap we call inflation. It gives you the ability to own your own money. It gives you the ability to spend your own money. And it gives you the ability to know with precision, backed by maths and code, the supply of Bitcoin anytime into the future. And it is a beautiful gift that the world gave us in 2008 through a white paper, and was released onto the world in 2009, that I discovered in 2011 when I published the first published book in the world to include Bitcoin, and spoke at the first Bitcoin conference and launched Bank to the Future, the company to support the companies that built the Bitcoin industry. And we have been sharing that journey together ever since on YouTube, and I will continue to do this for as long as I can talk, because Bitcoin gave me the escape from the tyranny of central banking. And I want that for as many people as possible. So this week, we're going to be covering, as usual, this week in Bitcoin, this week in macro, and this week in geopolitics. And boy, if you got my email and newsletter, you will know that a lot happened this week. So make sure you are signed up at simondixon.com and have a free login to the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, where I keep you up and date every single week, and make sure you have all the resources to just make sure you know what's happening each week and build better habits to escape the tyranny of central banking. So when Bitcoin crashes below $55,000, what do? We do exactly what we did when the price was $1, $10, $100, $1,000. When I experienced Bitcoin crashing from $30 to $3, 90% in 1 week, I did the same thing as when it was $30 and $3. When Bitcoin crashed from $1,000 to $250, I did the same thing. Make sure I had more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. When Bitcoin crashed from $20,000 to $3,000, I did the same thing. Make sure I had more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. And when Bitcoin crashed from $69,000 to $16,000, I did the same thing. Make sure I had more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. And now when Bitcoin crashes from $74,000 to just under $55,000, I do the same thing. Make sure I have more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. Everybody that I know that did that for a 4-year cycle became a Bitcoin thinker and never turned back. And they escaped the tyranny of the proof of weapons network, where they can actually bring more to society. They can serve humankind as a productive human that is able to save. They can fight oppression without having to worry about their own oppression from central banking, and they can add value. And that's what I want for everybody. And that's the moment that you become a Bitcoin thinker. So let's jump straight in. So any Americans that were celebrating the 4th of July, happy Independence Day. You escaped the tyranny of the monarchy that was funded by a loan of $1.2 million from William Patterson to King William or King Charles, I forget the name, they'll look back at my history, through the Bank of England, and took over the Great British Pound and created the first proof of weapons network in order to fund both sides of the war between Britain and France, so that it could build the system that we have today. You got and escaped the tyranny of it, but now you are occupied by the same force than many people don't know. And that is the Federal Reserve that was created by the same group of people that created the Bank of England. And they use that in order to use the proof of weapons network to control the criminal enterprises called intelligence agencies like CIA and Mossad that now occupy your politicians, where who you think is in charge is not in charge. When you follow the money, the whole world makes sense. So happy 4th of July. I hope you break free from the tyranny of the forces that control you today. But you can do that as an individual, where you don't need to worry about your government if you become a Bitcoin thinker rather than a fiat thinker. So why is Bitcoin crashing? Well, the reason that everyone's giving it that is crashing is because of 10 years ago. We put all of our Bitcoin onto an exchange. It was probably one of the only ways of buying it back then. A couple of companies went bust, but an exchange called Mt. Gox for 10 years held everyone's Bitcoin after they went bust, and now they are paying them out. And the first movements of Bitcoin, we've been covering it every week on Bitcoin Hard Talk. But remember, it is the supply and demand dynamics of the fear and motions of fear and greed that drive the markets. And then people find a narrative to match up. At the moment, at this time of the cycle, we had the halving cycle that took us to new all-time highs. And Bitcoin halves every 4 years. And every 4 years, we find a new narrative to why Bitcoin is crashing. And the Peter Schiffs and all the naysayers, they come along and say, Bitcoin is over, Bitcoin is dead. The same cycle ever since I've been involved for the last 13 years. And in 2024, we call it the Mt. Gox correction. And people are selling their Bitcoin to the people that are Bitcoin thinkers. The fiat thinkers are panicking, and the Bitcoin thinkers are accumulating. In 2020, at this exact same time, we called it COVID. Maybe I'm not allowed to say that on YouTube, but hopefully it works on all my other videos. But that was the 2020 cycle. At this same time, it crashed down to $100,000. Exactly the same thing. In 2016, we called it the Bitfinex flash crash. And during the flash crash, after that, there was a hack. And at Bank to the Future, we were involved in the best recovery, where we restructured the company. But at that time, it was called the Bitfinex flash crash, this exact time in 2016. In 2012, there was a Chinese Ponzi scheme as well. And we said that's the reason why Bitcoin's over and Bitcoin is crashing. And then after it goes through its normal cycle and the supply and demand kick in, and the world realizes that the demand for money you can own, money you can spend, and money that has a fixed supply, the fundamentals never changed. So let's look at some of the numbers. I was on a space earlier and Rand, one of the guests there, he was breaking down the numbers. So I jotted down a few of them. There is 141,000 Bitcoins that are coming. Now, remember, the original bankruptcy case was 880,000 Bitcoin, but only 141 survived the tyranny of bankruptcy processes. Only 71,000 of those are going to be distributed, and they just started being distributed. And for some reason, they picked Independence Day as the day they're going to be distributing. But they will all come through July and October, and there'll be people that can't claim them or can't get their KYC and stuff like that. Remember, there's two different types of creditors there. There's going to be the Bitcoin OGs, the ones that don't need to sell. They're incredibly wealthy. There's the ones that are going to decide to take some off the table. But there's also the people that bought all the claims over the years, and they tend to have made a position. They'll look to sell some of their Bitcoin, most likely, lock in some of those profits because they figured out the whole mass. And then you've got all the hardcore Bitcoiners. What they will do, we do not know. But the more of them that are fiat thinkers and need to sell, what does that mean for us? The more we get to accumulate, the better price that we get to accumulate this month. And if they continue to do that, then the better. You want the price to go down when you are a Bitcoin thinker. The price going up just means you have to pay more to get your cut of the fixed supply of 21 million Bitcoins that will never change. Okay. And we're most likely that the ETF volume can suck that up. What we don't know is how ETFs are going to react. Are they fiat thinkers or Bitcoin thinkers? We shall see. Well, some of their risk management policy will say if Bitcoin corrects 20%, we have to sell it just because it's a risk management policy, which will create more of an opportunity for the Bitcoin thinkers as well. And for some reason, they decided to pick a public holiday of Independence Day in order to start those distributions as well. Okay. Well, what else is happening in the Bitcoin market? Well, this week we had an announcement from the plonkers at the Department of Justice. For those of you, I think that's a UK term, plonker, Rodney Trotter. You will know that if you're a Brit. Maybe you do in the US, but the plonkers at the US government, Department of Justice, has about 200,000 Bitcoin down to about 160,000, I believe. They are looking to sell those. So they engaged Coinbase, a company that we invested in very early at the private round at Bank to the Future. And many of our investors got all of the upside when it floated on the market for $100 billion market cap. But Coinbase, they got a $32.5 million contract with a division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The division is called the U.S. Marshal Service, and they engaged Coinbase in order to manage and dispose of their Bitcoin. Now, who else is Coinbase servicing? Well, Coinbase is the custodian for most of the Bitcoin ETFs. And so if you are the US government and you want to sell, and you are a Bitcoin ETF, and as companies like Morgan Stanley, which they said will happen in August, open up to all of the largest network of retirement funds, then you get to match them together over the counter rather than creating selling pressure on an exchange. The US government gets better value because the US government is broke. The growth rate of their debt is increasing at a higher rate than the growth rate of the economy, and therefore they go deeper and deeper into the hole, and they have $1 trillion of interest to service, which is even more than they're spending to service the upheaval or upholding of the proof of weapons network as well. Now, what's interesting is while the Department of Justice, the left hand of the government, is saying, hey, the Federal Reserve gets to print money, but we need some dollars. So the Department of Justice needs to sell the hardest form of money in order to pay their staff in dollars, even though dollars go down in value and the Federal Reserve is continually inflating away at the dollar value. And the other agency, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is suing the company that is trying to sell the Bitcoin. And the administration of Biden is using Coinbase in order to accept Bitcoin payments so that they can then sell the crypto, so that they can pay the dollars in order to pay for the marketing of a failing administration where the person in charge of that administration, the network that really controls where the dollars, the Federal Reserve prints the dollars, sends it out to CIA and Mossad and the agencies that control the world, and then determine that we need to have an early debate because we have decided that Trump is the next politician. And we send $100 million to Trump's campaign. And then for the first time, we decide to put in an early debate that makes Biden look bad. Biden started accepting some of those crypto payments. And the network has decided that we need to coincide UK politics, where they have a snap election all of a sudden. Rishi Sunak has decided, oh, I'm no longer in charge. We now need to change it to the Keir Starmer, who has taken more money from Israel, and he now needs to be in charge. And so you get this circle of craziness that's happening, and the Biden administration starts to accept those crypto payments. And those looking to think the key to this is getting the left to remain in charge. They start thinking we can have less inflation or they can spend more on us. They start to send their crypto to the US government. The US government then sells it, and you end up without your Bitcoin because you engaged in a process that was already predetermined by the powers that be anyway, because all the money gets printed from the central banking network anyway, in order to fund the special interests and node operators at the central bank, which is the lobby groups, as we've already said. So the SEC has decided to continue suing the network. They're meant to be protecting investors. Instead, they let these services prevail, and then they sue them once it is too late. Regulations through enforcement. Let the consumers lose their money and then come back and sue them. So although the Consensus, which is an early Ethereum company that is kind of like the Federal Reserve, let's call it, for the Ethereum network. They basically were told that they're no longer being sued for the transition from ETH, from the proof of work network to the proof of stake network. They're not being sued for that because BlackRock and all the other powers that be are ready to launch an Ethereum ETF, which is due to be approved. It was meant to be approved this week. Looks like there's going to be additional delays there, but we shall see. But they are still suing the decentralized exchanges like MetaMask that allows you to own your own ETH, sell it for another token, but do it all in a decentralized way. BlackRock in the middle. They call those unregistered securities brokers. And so they continue to sue in order to centralize the parts of the ecosystem that they want to control as well. We also saw at the same time a bit of a parallel victory for Binance, which is another centralized exchange. They are being sued by multiple agencies, but the federal judge decided to dismiss some of the charges that the SEC's lawsuit is inflicting upon Binance and CZ, who is serving a 4-month prison sentence for the work that he was doing with Binance as well. And so what did they drop? Well, they started to drop, I think they're continuing some of the secondary. So they launched their own token called the BNB token. And they are still being sued, I believe, for distributing and selling some of those tokens. There is also going to be charges against Binance for doing the initial coin offering in order to fund the business. They're also looking at any of the ongoing sales of BNB tokens. Their BNB Vault service They're looking at their staking services, so whether those are securities, and also the failure to register. And they will continue some of the frauds that they say they committed. But the charges that are going to be dropped are going to be the secondary sales of BNB and some of the earn program as well, where they offer yield to people for putting up. Those two have been dismissed. So we will see. So they got a little bit of a dismissal. And so that was all announced this week. What else did we get announced this week on the Bitcoin side? Well, Sony, they decided that they're going to announce the launch of their new crypto exchange. They acquired a crypto exchange, and they're going to be launching that in Japan rather than South Korea. But Sony is also going to be, they're going to be doing that in Japan, obviously, based upon the announcement. And for those of you that don't know, Bitcoin already has a real deep history in Japan. If you look at the history of Japanese central banking, it was quantitative easing that was created by the deep relationship between the Federal Reserve and the Japanese central bank. In the post-war Reconstruction era, and before that in the Great Depression, between the First World War and the Second World War, quantitative easing was invented by Japan and created the largest welfare state with the largest amount of debt. And the Japanese central bank was buying all sorts of stocks and US debt as well. The Federal Reserve loved it because it had a new market for its debt. It was able to go deeper and deeper into debt by both the Bank of Japan and the government as well, and created the largest welfare state and debt-based Ponzi scheme, which never actually recovered the stock market. The stock market went up and it crashed by about 80% based upon all the fake funny money, and it's only just got back to those levels now as we hit the stage where US and Japan, through that relationship, have excessive debt to GDP relative to many other countries that are not so aggressively in the central operating in the central banking network. But based upon that, Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonym for the group of people or individual that created Bitcoin, obviously took his name, or the group of people took their name from Japan. And talking about Mt. Gox, the big exchange that went bust in 2014, it was launched from Japan, and it was part of the Japanese bankruptcy process. And after 10 years, they decided to pay out those Bitcoin right now. So we suddenly get this scenario where the US government engages Coinbase in order to sell the US government Bitcoin. The German government confiscate a bunch of Bitcoin in order to sell those. And the Japanese bankruptcy process decides to distribute all on the 4th of July. Now, whether that is a conspiracy theory or coincidence, I don't care, because these are one-time events that will not oppress the network. This is just supply-demand economics that plays in the favor of the Bitcoin thinker, and the fiat thinker will get wrecked because they're thinking of their dollar value rather than the accumulation of Bitcoin and saving in digital hard sound money that allows you to own it, allows you to spend it, and allows you to protect yourself from the atrocities of the inflation that is created by the proof of weapons network called fiat currency, backed by central banking and the bank nodes and the lobby groups that control it. And so Japan actually had the highest level of Bitcoin adoption as a unit of account. You could go to Japan, I went many times, and spend my Bitcoin and test it out. And it had a real high level of adoption right after China. China was the real early volume of the Bitcoin community in the early days. And also Japanese yen, as soon as it got its fiat currency to, where are we now, 263% debt to GDP, and created that largest welfare state that could end up, even through its currency open market operations with the Fed and the Bank of Japan, could be the systemic risk event that takes us through to the next monetary renegotiation. It could end up being the Bank of Japan that does that. But they had that high level of Bitcoin adoption, and so probably has the greatest need for it. and probably would be one of the central bank digital currencies because they were the first ones to launch one of these digital JPYs. And we're experimenting with JPY coin, Jcoin, I think it was. They also had the first bank that got into Bitcoin, SBI Investments. They were mining Bitcoin from the early days. We're making many Bitcoin VC investments from the bank side as well. And they're probably the central bank that I speculated at a large scale would probably end up putting Bitcoin on their balance sheet if things get funky. What else did we see announcement this week? Well, Genesis Digital Assets, one of the largest private miners out there, they announced that they're looking to do an IPO. They were going to be doing it before, but one of their largest investors in the pre-IPO round was Alameda Research. Alameda Research invested $1 billion. We know that Alameda Research was the Ponzi scheme hedge fund run by Sam Bankman-Fried and the cronies that ended up connecting it to the FTX exchange and losing $8 billion of client money. And $1 billion of those was Alameda Research. And so now they're looking to get through that in the bankruptcy process because they managed to dollarize the claim when Bitcoin was valued at about $16.50. They get to pretend that they're making creditors whole because the bankruptcy process is a fiat thinker rather than a Bitcoin thinker. And they get to keep the upside. And we will see what happens to those assets when they could have been restructured, as I lobbied for in the Celsius case, where you structure the assets into giving to creditors where they get to keep the upside, because I pushed the bankruptcy to keep the Bitcoin, which ended up recovering an additional $2 billion in the case of the Celsius bankruptcy, and meant that everyone got their Bitcoin and restructured the assets so that the upside goes to creditors rather than going to someone else where it doesn't belong to. But anyway, that company was valued at about $5.5 billion in the last round. They've now got about 500 megawatts across 20 different centers, with about 150,000 different ASICs and miners that they have kept private, and they look to bring as a public company. Also from the Celsius bankruptcy, there will be the Ionic Digital. We got some photos of there. If you are a Celsius creditor, head over to the simondixon.com blog, hit the blog section, and I gave all the updates and all the photos of everything that the team consolidated together if you want to get some different updates there as well. Also in Bitcoin, where it kind of merges over to the macro side and the banking side, there was a crypto-friendly bank called Silvergate. Silvergate was the one that was servicing FTX. They created a network that allowed all the different companies within the network to transfer funds very cheaply and 24/7 by using blockchain across each other. But it also enabled Alameda Research and FTX to transfer money across each other. And because of that, those were the proceeds of crime, and they had a lax anti-money laundering policy as a result. They just settled a $63 million fine to the regulators after FDIC took over the bank and shut it down. The SEC, the Federal Reserve, and the California state regulators will all be receiving that money. And obviously shareholders got wiped out in the process as a result of it. Basically they are being done, and that settlement was for their lacks of a real robust AML program and representing that they did have one. The executives as well of Silvergate, they got banned for 5 years from being involved in any public companies in those roles. And that brings us to all of the Bitcoin updates. So we're going to now move over to the macro and geopolitical section. Just before I do that, do me a favor. If you're enjoying this content, I would love for you to like, share, subscribe, hit that subscribe button, hit that bell symbol, hit all, and YouTube will notify you every time we go live. And I do different interviews throughout the week. I upload them to the YouTube channel. I've been documenting this whole journey of transitioning from a proof of weapons network to a proof of work network and Bitcoin. For over 13 years now. So this channel has got that whole journey. You'll get those notifications. Okay, I'm going to take a quick water break. So do me a favor. If you are watching this on X, repost. If you're watching this on Rumble, like whatever you do there. If you're watching it on LinkedIn, share. If you're watching it on YouTube, then put some comments below. Hit the like, hit the bell symbol, hit all. I'm going to take a quick water break. Do that on 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay, right. We are at the halfway mark and we're going into the macro section. There wasn't too much going on in the macro world, but there was a bunch of politics which may or may not impact Bitcoin short term, but definitely not long term, other than proving why we need Bitcoin. So I'm predicting at this stage that rates are going to be held for the rest of the year in US. The Federal Reserve is the most important central bank that dictates it. Obviously, when Trump gets in, he will want rates to go down and he will be lobbying for them to go down. And depending on the Federal Reserve and what they're going to be backing and who they want to be in charge next, they will determine whether rates go up, whether rates go down. That will determine the level of wealth inequality. If rates go down, it means that the price of Bitcoin is likely to pump up alongside the stock market and the real estate market. And that creates massive wealth inequality, which is why I want people to be Bitcoin thinkers rather than fiat thinkers. If you're saving in fiat currency, you will be on the wrong side of that trend, and you will get wrecked further and further into debt slavery as a result of massive wealth inequality as the Fed redistributes by lowering rates and creating inflation. That benefits only those that have the assets, or they will hold them, or they will increase them, in which case we will enter into a more depressive market, which lowers prices, which is good for those that need more affordable housing, and normalizes markets since they've been intervening. But you have to go through higher unemployment because the whole thing is one big gigantic Ponzi scheme that central bankers can only use to redistribute wealth, and that ends up in escalating war and tensions, internal conflicts, where you get the types of elections that we're seeing right now, where you end up voting for two people you didn't want to vote for, but they are on the extreme left, extreme right. That creates massive hate amongst each other between the haves and haves not. That creates internal conflicts. And then that leads to external parties deciding that they're going to launch wars against the weaknesses of the existing power structure. And then we end up, hopefully not in an aggressive war, but a change in empire and a monetary renegotiation and a return to hard money that then kicks off another peace cycle. And then the central banks figure out how to get rid of that hard money. The next empire goes in for the next 100 years. The cycle repeats itself again. But anyway, I'm thinking that they're going to be holding, but if the powers that be decide that they need to lower rates to and they can make people think that there's no inflation, despite the fact that everybody is suffering, and that drives the governments deeper and deeper into debt at the benefit of the central bank, so they can pump more money, push it to agencies, and the lawlessness of those agencies then control the governments. And now the G7 nations, they are accountable for 61% of all the world's government debt today, because they have the most aggressive central banks, which is creating this multipolar world. And we always follow the BRICS network. Not much happened on the BRICS side today, but everything's getting ready for the conference in October, where more and more countries are applying to do that. Also, a little bit of a fun story on the macro and the stock market side. The resistance movement from the small stock traders that try and beat the system and take down the large hedge funds that are connected to the central banks and get to borrow at 0%. And those people that are on the wrong side of saving in dollar money rather than Bitcoin, they end up using their credit cards to buy some stocks. They pull together themselves en masse, and obviously GME and GameStop is the kind of meme stock for those that want to build that resistance movement against the hedge fund. Well, Roaring Kitty, the person behind the movement, he's going to be the charges against securities fraud for GameStop and his actions. The lawsuit has actually been dismissed. So that is an interesting one to continue to watch. But before we get through the geopolitical side, really, I just wanted to cover a little bit on the elections that are happening right now as we speak. So if you are in the UK, you would be right now in the transition of a 14-year conservative right-wing government, which is meant to spend less, but they spent more, which is meant to spend less so that we have less inflation. But obviously they spent and printed from the Bank of England, and that drove up the prices of real estate, as we've discussed, creating all the wealth inequality and the crisis that we had. You change a politician. We had a quick one, Liz Truss. She destroyed the bond market when she tried to actually get back to cartelling some of what you need to do in order to get back to sustainable economics. She had to get booting out because it destroyed the bond market and destroyed the currency, and the Bank of England had to step in, and that obviously created more inflation as well. But right now, we are now transitioning over after 14 years to a UK labour market. The new hero, Keir Starmer, who was determined that Rishi Sunak, after making a bunch of money through his investments in vaccines, was decided that now it's time for me to step aside. And he apologized, saying, the people have clearly spoken. They don't want me anymore. The powers that be have decided that both the UK and US, the leadership needs to change right now. So we had the snap election, and we had the early debate between Trump and Biden. And now the traditional media on the left side turned against Biden for whatever the plan is next. In UK politics, it was a landslide Labour victory. We, as people in the UK, I left the country a long time ago, but we had 412 Labour seats, 121 Conservative seats, and this was an interesting one, 4 for the Reform Party seats. Now, the Reform Party, although they only got 4 seats, they did take a lot of votes from the Conservative Party, because the Conservative Party and the Labour Party and the Reform Party all take Israeli lobby money. But Conservative Party were not meant to get through this time. Labour is meant to get through. And Keir Starmer obviously has exercised covering up of all the atrocities of Israel throughout this whole process. And the Israeli lobby also was funding the Reform Party that is sent to give a anti-Muslim, anti-immigration message in order to make people think that that's the real problem. And so there was a lot of votes that went from Conservative to that message as well. But the Reform Party is also meant to spread the media message that the Israeli lobby wants to be spread, because that's where all the money went in doing that, and to split the vote. And when you split the vote between Conservative and the Reform Party, it means you get the landslides that Labour had right now. So not that many more were voting for Labour, but all of those Conservative votes went over to Reform. That split the vote and ensured that Conservative lose. Not that it makes any difference, because we know who is really in charge here. But also, this was the Reform Party is headed up by Nigel Farage. Now, Nigel Farage was meant to deliver an agenda. He was meant to trick the British people into thinking Brexiting was an FU to the establishment. And he pushed that narrative forward very, very well. But obviously, the powers that control and decided the Bank of England needs to remain independent from the European Central Bank. Britain had the best deal. They already had the complete control of the central bank, and they didn't need to go into the European Central Bank like Germany did. Germany and Britain have big military industrial complex. They have big pharma, and they have a big banking lobby. But those lobby groups decided, let's make Britain Brexit so that we have more autonomy over those industries, because we can then control the ECB independently and the Bank of England independently through those proof of weapons network. And let's make sure that Britain Brexits even though it already had its own currency. So it had all the benefits of being in Europe, but it didn't have the control of the European Central Bank and ECB. So the powers that be decided that we need to put more funding into Nigel Farage and the Reform Party and make sure that we get that message through. And that message obviously coincides with the message that Israel wants to put through, which is the message of the CIA and the Mossad and MI5, which is that we need to be concerned about immigration and the Muslim vote. But they split it, and then Labour gets in charge as well. Remember, inflation is not determined by the politicians that are in charge. Inflation is what is causing people to decide they need to change their political leader right now. They think because we got all of this inflation and the right of protecting the rich through real estate and stocks, that now we need somebody that's going to give us more stuff. And by giving us more stuff, you have to get the government to pay for more stuff. And to get the government to pay for more stuff, you get more inflation. The Bank of England loves it. The Bank of England gets to print the money, and the whole circle of the proof of weapons network continues. And they also get to justify the NATO expansion in order to funnel more money to the powers that be in Ukraine and Israel, and of course later Taiwan as well. But the reality is that the inflation was caused by the Bank of England. And the power that controls the Bank of England ain't really going to change, so it does not really matter, because at the top of the chain is the central bank. Underneath that is the intelligence agencies, and the intelligence agencies, through lawlessness and the money of the central bank, go further down into the politicians. The politicians are further down the chain. They call it democracy. We make us think that we're voting. They control through the media where we go and the direction of that. And we have to have resistance movements of we the people that try and bust what the media is telling us at the bottom as well. So everyone gets to think that this is going to be different. And guess what? There will be just as much inflation, just as much cost of living crisis, and you will be begging your government to subsidize you through a universal basic income and a central bank digital currency, when eventually it is determined that all of the banks, remember we covered that in previous, they need to be gobbled up because they're all running Ponzi schemes by creating the digital pound and the digital dollar and the digital euro. Eventually, they get rolled over into the large banks that control the system, that then gets rolled over into the central banks, which then transitions the economy from capitalism to socialism to communism. And you get to blame the whole thing in capitalism, when we don't have capitalism unless you have hard money. And we don't have hard money, which is why we exit into digital hard sound money. And every individual, every company, and every country and central bank gets to transition, which is why Bitcoin is a big problem for that control structure. Anyway, it's all the funds get to be directed by the banks. The banks determine who gets the loan. You get a 0% loan if you are connected to the central bank. And if you are the plebs on the other side, like you end up paying 30% on credit cards and having to supplement your income through payday loans. And you get on the wrong side of that, and therefore you can't purchase your house. You get deep in debt, thinking the house that you're purchasing puts you in a lifetime mortgage, a forever debt, while the rest of the people benefit from forever wars in the proof of weapons network. So welcome to UK politics. That is, you will see it play out, and we will cover it every single week. Now, obviously, the intelligence agencies decided that the president of Iran should no longer be with us. And so right now, as we speak, there's going to be the results of the Iranian election, once a helicopter suddenly dropped down and killed the president of Iran and some of the other politicians on that side. Which then brings us into the geopolitical update for this week, because we are trying to make sure there are no escalations, but the powers that be that control the central banks and the proof of weapons networks are ensuring that we don't enter peace negotiations. So what is Keir Starmer's first job as leader of the United Kingdom and our new prime minister? It is, of course, to go to the NATO conference next week and the NATO summit and try and bring us further and further into sending more money to Ukraine and, unfortunately, tragically, ending up with more Ukrainian lives being pawned off in a war, a forever war that can't be won until there is negotiations with the nuclear power and the other side of the Cold War. And you have to just face that those negotiations need to happen. But obviously, Boris Johnson ensured that those didn't happen, and that cost more and more Ukrainian lives in order to try and weaken the proof of weapons network and the nuclear side of Russia, the equal power in terms of nuclear. But it has a less debt to GDP ratio. And the resources are not controlled by the lobby groups, so it gets to subsidize its economy through oil and forming strategic alliances with other countries. And those alliances were getting a lot more confident, even members of Europe, as I will be discussing. Right. So it is the NATO summit next week. And what did we have? Let me check some of the notes, what we got here. We had some announcements from China as well. No, it was from NATO. And NATO is making the announcement to make us ensure that we are all scared of China. And so that is the next narrative that we need to be scared of. And China, a country that built the Great Wall of China in order to keep the barbarians out, that does not have a history of aggression, but we need to make sure that the narrative of aggression scares China into thinking that the chips that control AI in Taiwan we need to be concerned with them reunifying, and we need to destabilize the balance and the status quo, where if they end up doing it, the lobbies that control the networks can sell a lot more weapons to NATO. And of course, to be a member of NATO, you have to spend a minimum amount of money from the US military-industrial complex and the German military-industrial complex and the British military-industrial complex, so that they can make more sales to pump up those stock prices, and they get to do that subsidized by the central banks that determine that's how you back the network. But NATO is saying that China is now incurring the largest military-industrial side as well, and it is going to be the largest conflict with Europe since World War II. That's the language that they are saying by supporting Russia. So they're basically saying, gearing up for a narrative around World War III, which is allowing Russia to develop the most advanced missiles and drones, which are then being sold for use across Iran, Russia, and China as well. And so that was the effect of the sanctions. NATO said that Hungary, a member of the European Union, that went across to visit Putin this week, that does not represent any kind of NATO following or any type of message as well. And so anyone that goes to visit Putin and tries to negotiate how these things move forward is frowned upon from its NATO members, because all you're allowed to do is spend the money that the European Central Bank prints in America into the military-industrial complex, so that that money can be used to pay the interest on the debt to the Federal Reserve, so the money can go up the chain and fund the intelligence agencies. Donald Trump, who, for whatever reason, it seems that he is the one that's meant to be in charge next. He says that China, Russia, and North Korea, under his leadership, will not be enemies if he is elected. This is what we want to hear. But notice how it didn't mention Iran. And notice how Trump has a good relationship with Russia, confrontational type of relationship with the failed trade war with China, but the only one that got the $100 million check throughout this process from Zionist entities is not allowed to say that they're going to have peace with is, of course, Iran, because that is the fundamentals of the entire process that the lobbyist groups and the Israeli lobby want to push forward and make the narrative that's right through Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer in the UK, and make sure that everybody understands the agenda that Israel wants to push forward. Putin came out and said that Russia is actually ready to resume dialogue with the United States, but only under the new administration. So Putin's saying that there's no hope for peace unless Trump comes into power. And so that is the next narrative that's pushed forward. Chinese President Xi Jinping, he declares that his intention to end Russia's war with Ukraine. So Xi Jinping and China are saying, we want to be the peace negotiator. But remember, what is it that Xi Jinping is saying? They're saying a different narrative. They're saying that we need a Palestinian state and we need to normalize between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And they need to have self-determination if we lend any of those countries through the Belt and Road Initiative with no regime change, which is the opposite of the IMF loan and the partnership between the central banks and the intelligence agencies that give the Israeli message the ability to go through. And so at the same time, the League of Arab States, they officially decided that they're going to remove, I'm not sure if YouTube will let me say this word, but Hezbollah, which is the resistance movement from Lebanon after the invasion of Israel into Lebanon, that later the Federal Reserve and the central bank decided to lead to devaluation, mass theft of the currency, the complete pilgrimage of everybody's savings through the proof of weapons network, a strategy that was tried to use on Egypt when they didn't cooperate by allowing for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian state. Well, the Arab League is now saying that they are not putting Hezbollah on the list, and you know what that list is, of terrorist organizations. And so they are taking them off that list. They believe that Hezbollah has a completely legitimate role in protecting Lebanon from future invasions in an environment where the proof of weapons network completely destroyed the central bank, everyone's savings. And so therefore it ends up with allies that formed the different relationships with Iran that the West wants to make sure you call them militias and proxies when they are resistance movements in their own countries from anyone that decides that the monarchies that are put in power because of the central banks should be resisted against. At the same time, Spain decided to officially, they're going to file its joint, a motion to join the South Africa genocide case for the atrocities that were committed by Israel against the Palestinian people. There are now 9 or 10 countries in the case where the ICC court has already, so the ICJ court has the highest court in the world, already determined that there is plausible genocide. And now we've got 15 of the 16 judges that ruled in that side, and now 9 of the countries, and Spain officially decided to join that as well. Turkey decided that it will resume its oil imports with Iran, and it is going to be ignoring US sanctions from now on. And so more and more countries are getting confidence in the multipolar world, the competing currencies, and deciding that a new force is allowing more competition within the currency market. Russia decided to come out and officially warn Israel that if it supplies weapons to Ukraine through the Israeli military-industrial complex, that there will be big consequences, so a bit more flexing. And Russia also decided that it was going to arm the resistance movements with the Yemenis Houthis to fight against using anti-ship ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. And because UK military industrial complex and US military industrial complex is making sure that it tries to maintain control over the Red Sea. And at the same time, we had escalations where Hezbollah is now the focus, all eyes on Lebanon as Israel's next target in the new vision of the Middle East that Netanyahu put up and has been spreading ever since the early initiatives with the pushing through the Iraqi wars and the Afghanistan wars and making sure that America supported those through its covert operations through Mossad and CIA, that they did an assassination of a senior commander at Hezbollah this week, which led to an escalation where 250 missiles and drones that were targeted at 7 precision Israeli military targets without following the rules of war, as it were, rather than civilian casualties. They were targeted at Israel in response to the assassination that Israel did last week. And I won't say the name that may get me banned, but for the algorithm, we'll say Hamas. Hamas started to escalate its ceasefire. Remember, there was a ceasefire 3 days immediately afterwards, that Israel decided that it wasn't going to put forward. And because of Julian Assange being free and WikiLeaks being able to continue, because it was funded by Bitcoin right after the financial blockade, we got more and more documents around what is really happening with Hamas. And there was lots and lots of different documents that made sure that the evidence behind that the United Nations published around everything we were told happened on October the 7th, that there is no evidence other than the Israeli government saying, trust me, bro. And many of the different leaks that are happening on WikiLeaks were showing that those Apache helicopters that killed many of Israel's people as well at the same time. I'm sure there were atrocities there, but many of them happened very, very differently to we are told. But the Hamas, the ceasefire was renewed again. And we saw Blinken come out and saying the whole world agreed that Israel has been trying to negotiate peace the whole way through. But remember what happened. There has been this demand for a ceasefire from day one through the United Nations councils. And then when it goes up to the Security Council, everyone unanimously agrees, and America veto votes against it, and then says that Hamas is the only one that's not doing it, when Israel never wanted the return of the hostages, because, as WikiLeaks revealed to us, that Mossad and Blinken's narratives, they released a bunch of documents that said, let me quote this, WikiLeaks revealed that Israel would be happy if Hamas took over Gaza way before October the 7th, because the IDF could then deal with Gaza as a hostile state. So this was all within the plan, and the official documents were released upon WikiLeaks. So thank you, Julian Assange, for creating WikiLeaks so that we get the official documents so we can fight back against the governments. But remember, the government's a great part of a control of a greater structure when you follow the money. And so the IDF intelligence chief, Amos Yadin, sorry if I said that incorrectly, that was the plan in 2007, according to the leaked documents. They wanted Hamas to take over so that the IDF could execute their vision of ethnic cleansing in order to push out the Palestinian state, which was a long-term policy that was implemented by using America in order to push forward the fake war on terror with all of the covert operations that were revealed by WikiLeaks and Julian Assange for us. and more will be revealed. And our job is to make sure that we are on the right side of these changes as we enter through this massively changing time, because we are able to all speak to each other and have a counter resistance movement against the traditional media that perpetuated all of these crimes, funded by the proof of weapons network called fiat currencies, that outsourced the creation of the digital currency called the dollar, the euro, and the pound to the private banks that get to dictate the flow of money into real estate and stocks, that get to borrow at a cheaper rate from the central banks, so that a wealth inequality can drive us into the inflationary-led economy where more and more violently oppose each other, so that the military-industrial complex can fund the wars and they can back the next central bank that is meant to be in charge as the new world orders get negotiated. But us as individuals, we get to resist against that thanks to, in 2008, Satoshi Nakamoto and that Japanese pseudonym that led the resistance movement, that gave us the ability to own our own money, spend our own money, and combat that inflation. So that's everything on the Bitcoin updates, the macro updates, and the geopolitical updates. As always, you have to remember, no matter how bad it gets, you are alive at one of the most changing times in financial history. Many are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do really well. And stay with me each week, because I want to make sure that you are on the right side of that change. At Bitcoin Hard Talk, every week I give you these updates. And if you want to head over to simondixon.com, then you can sign up and register to make sure you get notifications each and every week. Make sure you like this video. Make sure you share this video. Make sure you repost this video. Make sure you retweet it. Make sure you subscribe, hit the bell symbol, and hit all, because we want to do this with peace, love, and unity. And we're getting around that time of year. Each year and around the halving cycle, I release exactly how I invest live, and share all those details. So all of the members at simondixon.com, I'll make sure that you get the free video series that I'm going to be releasing. I always release it towards the end of the halving cycle, and make sure that you can transition to this peaceful world of Bitcoin proof of work, to prepare you for a world of Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies, where artificial intelligence has the power to create massive unemployment, and central bank digital currencies, massive oppression, and Bitcoin, the resistance movement against it. So I hope you enjoyed episode 37 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, and I will see you on the other side, and this time next week. Peace.